Welcome everyone to Genesis chapter 1, verses 20 to 23. This is the fifth day of creation. Oh, wait, hold on. Let me share the screen. There we go. All right. So, Genesis chapter 1, verses 20 to 23. The word of God says, Then God said, Let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens. So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which waters abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. So the evening and the morning were the fifth day. Make sure you pray before watching this, pray just to kind of get ready for the word. Get your Bible open, and we're going to jump right into this. So, verse 20 here, this is going to be an important one, and we're probably going to spend a little bit on this verse because it's going to tie back to part one, maybe part two. No, excuse me. It's going to tie back to part two, verses 6 to 8, and maybe some other parts. And I'm going to I might change, I'm actually going to correct myself when I said back in part two, as you'll see here. So, it says, so God said, remember, as we saw over and over again, whenever it says here, God said in this passage, this is God's authority to speak things into creation. What he's speaking now is he's filling the realm of the sea and the sky, the firmament and the waters. So just a quick recap of verses 6 to 8, there was the dividing of the waters from the waters. So we had the waters on earth and then some waters that were above the firmament. Now, we mentioned that the firmament was the sky. But to be more specific, which I probably should have back in that part, it's not just the sky, it's actually the entire atmosphere, which is what I would think is the best interpretation. Now, there's other views, right? There's some people that might take a more traditional, ancient Jewish cosmological view that it's a solid surface. I wouldn't go that route because I interpret the Bible in light of general revelation, which I do not believe is wrong, although some people do believe it's wrong. I don't know why, because the Bible does speak of general revelation. But yeah, so, and by the way, you like my display name here? Or not my display name, my title there, Firmament Guy. All right, anyway. I might do little wacky titles for each part, but I don't know, we'll see. So, just a quick recap of that, because it's important for this passage, because this verse kind of helped me to understand it better and kind of corrected me on certain things. So I mentioned that and back in that part in verse 6, when we were talking about verse 6, I said that the waters above were the clouds. And my reasoning was, number one, the Hebrew word can mean up to. And the other thing I mentioned is that there are verses that mention the clouds as like, do I want to open up comments? I don't know what I'm going to open up here, but the verses that mention the clouds in that sort of manner, where there's water coming down from them. But I've recently, like literally just read yesterday, I've sort of reconsidered, and I think I'm going to change my position and correct myself on that. And here's why. So the waters obviously abound. We'll get to that in a little bit because we got to interpret every part here, right? We got to look at all the scripture here, not just skip through. A lot of people do that a lot of times. They're hasty to, for specific passages, they might be hasty to go to other parts and they'll skip certain parts. So I want to be careful here. I want to go through all scripture here. So verse 20, let the waters abound with abundance of living creatures. I like how the NET puts it here. God said, let the water swarm with swarms of living creatures. That's probably the best translation of it, given the Hebrew, because the Hebrew there has the same word for swarm, or similar word for swarm, and then the swarms. So literally, like, let the water swarm with swarms of living creatures. Or as the NKJV puts it, excuse me, it has a footnote, souls, right? We can actually check out the Hebrew word there. Let's share this tab. Let's check out the Hebrew word for creatures there. Interesting. So, not technically the word for soul, but it just means life in general, not necessarily creature, but living things, animals. And actually, let's look at that. So, adjective, masculine, and feminine nouns. Those are specific meanings depending on what it is. So, let's look at here. What is the code here? For life, I think it's feminine. Yep, feminine. So let's go back to life. And I believe this is the word for souls here. So the feminine ones will have living things such as animals, life, appetite. That's kind of weird. Revival, renewal, community. So more so animals or animal life, right? That's how it's being used here in Genesis 1. So the Hebrew is more literal, and we can go check out the Hebrew here really quick. We're not going to go to the meaning, but so these two words are very similar. Seras and seres, both basically meaning like swarm. We'll just look at this one. I didn't show it, but here, saras and seres. You see similar letters for the Hebrew language there, and then when we look at it, right? When we look at it, to swarm, multiply. So think of like a swarm of bees. That hath. I think this just living soul, right? So the word soul. This is the word for soul here. Living souls. And I believe this is the word mentioned when Rebecca. Yeah, so this is the word here used when Rebecca dies, and it came to pass as her soul was in departing, for she died, that she called his name Benoni, but this father called him Benjamin. So that's the word for soul there. That's the word for soul. So I had to correct myself. The other word was life. This one is soul. So you can say soul of life, living souls. I think living souls is fine. Living creatures is also perfectly fine. Either way. So, and then there's also obviously the word swarm. So we got abound is also a good word to translate it as, because abound, think of the word abundance, like literally right here, having a lot. You to abound means to have a lot, an abundance, a lot. So there's a lot of creatures that are being created here. They're being brought forth. And then also we have the birds. Let the birds fly above the earth. Now, obviously, birds can dwell on land for a certain time. I mean, I have parakeets. They are in the cage. Whenever they come out, which, I don't take them out that often because they're kind of scared, they'll fly around. They can fly, and birds naturally will fly around. But but obviously here, this is it's mainly talking about. They're flying. They can land on land, as you'll see, like in Genesis chapter 8, I believe. Noah will send out a dove and a raven. He sends them out. And obviously, he held them in his hand. It's not like they're flying all day long. They'll stop and rest at certain spots, but mainly they're in the air flying, which is what they're created for, to fly. Now, I have here highlighted, for a very important reason, across the face of the firmament of the heavens, or expanse. So to expound upon the word firmament there, because I want to kind of expound upon that and go back to that, because this is important. Let me actually open my content, because I took the note on that. I think that the firmament, well, obviously I know the firmament is the sky, or rather the atmosphere. So I that kind of got me thinking, why does it say in the face of? Now, some translations will say in the open, which is not really in the Hebrew. So for example, let's change this to KJV. And the KJV says, if I can find it, it's up. King James. You see, they're open firmament, but that's not in the Hebrew. The word is face of. So that got me thinking, what is it? Do I have the right view of the firmament? Let me open up. Let me get verse 6 though, because I got to get my notes on verse 6. I think I wrote something specific on verse 6. So the word in the midst of, right? The firmament is in the middle of the waters. And so it's to divide waters from waters. Now you can say that maybe, okay, so then there's layers, right? There's layers, and maybe a certain layer of the firmament is in the midst of the clouds and the waters on earth. But I think the more probable interpretation is what we mentioned back in part one, a certain form of the canopy theory. So let's go back. Let's just go back to verse 20. So I'm not suggesting a complete like ice theory above the earth. It could be just a different atmosphere that was above that was almost like filled with water in a way. Not exactly sure. But I think the way to understand this is that this is a certain layer. This is a certain layer of the atmosphere, because there's layers to the atmosphere, right? So I wouldn't say anymore the waters above are clouds. I think it was probably something like the canopy theory. It makes the most sense now that I'm reevaluating it. I was trying to avoid it, but I'm thinking like this probably makes the most sense. So across the face of the firmament, I think that's referring to like the face of a lower layer, but they fly through like the bottommost layer of the atmosphere. And then obviously it mentions like the waters that are above. And I also want to check because I saw a specific Hebrew word back in verse 6 that meant up to, but I don't remember exactly what. Okay, waters which were above or up to the firmament. But you can't reconcile that with verse 6 when it says in the midst of, because that's basically it right there. So I don't think the clouds fit well with verse 20 there. If you interpret it verse 6 there as clouds, you kind of struggle to understand verse 20. So I think I want to correct myself when I mentioned back in part 2 for verse 6 that it was the clouds. Now again, I'm not claiming to know for sure what the waters from the waters is. That's pretty interesting and pretty mysterious. So I'm not exactly sure. But I think I'm not going to say anymore that it's the clouds because I'm struggling to reconcile that with verse 20 here. Like if you interpret it as clouds, this phrase here kind of sounds strange. They're flying across the face of the firmament, but then that's literally where the clouds are. So I think there was some sort of a water, almost liquid atmosphere or something that was above, and you can possibly say that that was what was involved in the flood. Because remember, waters came from above, from the heavens. Let's look at that. Let's look at that. I think the same word back here in Genesis. Let's see. God made the heaven and they are semayin. So if we look at its usage, it's used throughout the text over and over again. And then if we get to see, windows of heaven were open. So the same word back in Genesis there. Look at Genesis. Hold on, I'm gonna share this tab. Look at Genesis 7:11 here. In the 600th year of Noah's life, so he's 600 years old here, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. So it's the same word for sky there. So the sky opened. So you could say the atmosphere possibly opened, and then that was the above atmosphere that God placed there. And it seems to be that the reason he placed it there is because he knew beforehand that I'm going to do this, right? God has foreknowledge, and he obviously has a plan from the beginning. So one of the reasons that he has that there is possibly for the flood, because the windows of heaven opened and then water came rushing down. So I think that's the best interpretation here of the firmament, of the waters from the waters, in light of this verse here. So I know we're spending a lot of time on that just for this phrase, but the birds fly across the face of the firmament of the heavens. And I think you can use this verse to understand verse 6. Let's go to verse 21. Let's go to verse 21. So God created great sea creatures. Let's open up a Reformation Study Bible because it mentions a phenomenal note here. So in Old Testament poetry, these are the dreaded sea dragons associated with ancient mythology, thought by pagans to rival the creating gods. And you have here Psalm 24:13, Isaiah 27:1. And we're going to look at these passages in a second. By adapting and modifying this pagan imagery, the Hebrew writers subverted the pagan theology. The goodness of creation and the subservience of the aquatic animals is stressed. So let's look at these passages, and I have them actually written down in my notes. So I pulled up these verses. So let's just look at them. Psalm 74:13. You divided the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea serpents in the waters. So they're mentioned as serpents mostly. Okay, Isaiah 27:1. In that day, Yahweh with his severe sword, great and strong, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. So you mentioned Leviathan there, who's also mentioned in Job, which we'll probably talk about him eventually in the Job series. Leviathan, that twisted serpent, and he will slay the reptile that is in the sea. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of Yahweh. Awake as in the ancient days, in the generations of old. Are you not the arm that cut Rahab apart and wounded the serpent? So they're mentioned as serpents. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has devoured me. He has crushed me. He has made me an empty vessel. He has swallowed me up like a monster. He has filled his stomach with my delicacies. He spit me out. So the monster, I think it's what it's talking about. Let me just double check to make sure I got the right thing there. But yeah, so you see they're mentioned even in the Hebrew and the Jewish, the books of poetry, and then some of them in the prophecy, right? I want to make sure I got the right passages. Okay, so yeah. So in those verses, we have here that the serpent or Leviathan, these are like reptile great sea creatures. And in certain pagan creation accounts, you could say, they were mentioned as like rivaling the gods or being out of control, or even maybe taking part in creation. I'll have to look into that more. I haven't really quoted any of these accounts yet. Maybe I'll do a video on the creation account of Genesis versus some of the other ones. Maybe, that could be a future video. But for now, just with this thought in our mind, look at what God does. He creates the great sea creatures, and it's almost like they just are submitting to him. And he just commands them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the waters and the seas, and fill the seas. Commanding these great sea creatures, these monsters. Literally, the word in Hebrew indicates some sort of a monster. Let's look at the word in Hebrew. Let's do that, because it indicates that, hey, we're looking at something here that's not exactly, not exactly your ordinary everyday thing in the sea. So it says here in the KJV, great whales. But what is the more literal way of understanding this? Tanin. So let's look at it. Ready? Dragon, serpent, or whale. Look at back in Exodus 7:9 here, that it becomes a serpent, like it's some sort of a dragon sea monster. They're not only in the sea. There's also them on land. So let's see. So it's not the same word for serpent in Genesis 3, so it's different. So look, dragons in Deuteronomy 32:33. So these are like great creatures that presumably either no longer exist, or maybe they were like, maybe it's mentioning like dinosaurs. There are certain dinosaurs that dwell in water that were great. Remember? I don't remember what it's called, but I might let me look at the picture. See? There's dinosaurs in water, like this one. This might be part of what it's talking about. So I'm not sure if that's the exact thing, but that's one thing to consider. All right. Anyway, let's see. So God creates these great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded, or once again swarmed, I believe is the same word again. I would have to, let me just double check. Let me not sneeze. The waters abounded. Yeah, same word, like swarmed with. Interesting, we have the word here, moveth, remas. Now, you have to creep. So we'll see in the next part, in the verse by verse, the creeping things in Genesis. Like, for example, here, Genesis 1:26, everything that creepeth on the earth. That word essentially just means move, or it can be moved lightly. Also, in specific context. Oh, I didn't even pull it up. I always do that. So creep, team, move lightly. So it basically just means move, but it can have certain implications like move lightly. So God makes every living thing that moves. Not just moves lightly. Everything that moved in the waters and everything in the sky. He created them. So all these great sea creatures, the sea monsters, if you will, like maybe that specific dinosaur or whatever. Every living thing that moves, all of them, God created them, with which the waters abounded or swarmed. They multiplied, they were filled, and this is by the authority of God speaking things into creation according to their kind. Now, I don't think we've explored that yet, really. The word according to their kinds. Look at my content here. The phrase according to its kind seems to indicate creationism more than evolution, in which different species emerge from different species, right? So there might be other different ways in which people understand the word according to their kind. The way I see it, I think it shows the unique creation of God. I think it's different than evolution here. Now, I don't have a problem with someone interpreting this in with a more evolutionary or old Earth perspective, as long as you're remaining God as a creator. Because again, as I mentioned back in part one, we don't have an exact, we don't have the Bible telling us how old the Earth is or whatever. So, according to its kind, I would see that as more contrary to evolution. I think this is more of a, hey, this is the uniqueness of the species of creature, each coming from their own kind. But another way you might understand it is maybe, I don't know, let me think for a second. Maybe kind here is not necessarily referring to the species, but it's just referring to, hey, God creates each of them according to their kind. So he created each one, but again, I don't know if that would it would probably you probably have a more metaphorical interpretation, probably. Because as we mentioned back in part one, people would have metaphorical interpretations of different things in Genesis 1, like the days. So that'd probably be some sort of metaphorical interpretation, like the kind here. It's something. I think it's literal that this is contrary to evolution, but whatever. And every winged bird, according to its kind, the same thing with them. All the winged birds or the flying creatures. Let me actually pull up the physical study Bible because it has an interpretive note there, or more translation note, I think. I want to pull it up. Okay, the other way to read it is flying things, not necessarily every winged bird. Let's look at the Hebrew. Let's just see what the Hebrew says. I like looking at the Hebrew here. Haven't done that much in the series. Hold on a second. Am I looking at the right thing? Okay, every winged fowl. Look at the Hebrew because it says flying things in this interpretive note. So I'm not sure. So winged. You see here. Wing, border, corner, skirt. Okay, wing is obviously what it's being used as here. That's and then flying creatures, fowl, insects, birds. So winged flying creatures. You can also understand it that, but birds is just a more simple interpretation or translation. Because if they had like more complicated exact word for word, that would just be, that would be a little much. Let's actually let's go to Bible Hub here. Let's look at that. Fowl with wing. So yeah, that's Young's literal translation. Smith's literal translation. Every bird of wing, bird with wing. So yeah. All right, let's go back. The literal translations are pretty good just to see the Hebrew, but either way, anyway. And then once again, God seeing these things as good. He notices his creation as good. God creates and it's good, contrary to some of the other pagan accounts, right? When the pagan gods create, there seems to be some sort of chaos, as far as I'm aware of them. But when God creates, it's all good. He has the authority over it. And God blessed them. Notice that. The blessing of God. I think this is the first time we see God here blessing, if I'm not mistaken. And so, for example, in Genesis 32, we're going to see God's blessing on Jacob. So God can give certain blessing. Let's look at the word for bless. Let's look at the word for bless. What does it mean there that God blessed them? Let's look at here. Share this tab. God blessed them. Barak here, and it can also mean to blaspheme. Wow. Okay. Whoa. Okay. You know what? Let's look at some definition. How about that? Because the Hebrew is not exactly giving me much. All right. So let's look at a definition of the word blessed. To pronounce words in a religious rite, to confer or invoke divine favor on, ask God to look favorably on. So this seems to be like in favor, right? Bring favor upon, bring good tidings, bring goodwill upon, something good upon. Now I'm not going to say that only God can bless, because you can receive blessings, like for example Abraham blesses, but God's blessing is unique. And remember that when we get to Genesis 32, because that's going to be important. God's blessing is unique. So when God blesses Jacob, that's going to be something unique. So God blesses his unique blessing on all these sea creatures, everything that moves in the waters, all the birds in the air, everything. This is his blessing to them. Almost like a command. Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. Whoa. Okay. I keep always messing up that screen there. Let's see. So let's look at, I don't know if I want to see here, be fruitful. Okay. Bear fruit. All right. Let's look at what fruitful means. Let's do that. All right. So you see here the word fruitful, right? So for example, a tree will produce fruit, right? Literally. So here, for example, of a person to produce offspring. Here it's being used as offspring. Be fruitful. So that's what God is telling the animals here, to be fruitful, to have offspring. And he tells it to man, all the animals. And he says it to Noah after. Look, in Genesis here, Genesis 8:17. Be fruitful and multiply on the earth. So that's a command for creatures to reproduce, have offspring. Let's see here. And it can also mean here to bring forth something. Look at Isaiah, bring forth. So it's not necessarily in the context of like offspring, but it can be more metaphorical and bringing something forth. But here it's being literal, like, just be multiply, have offspring, and fill the waters and seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. But it can also mean in certain contexts, like the fruits of the spirit. These are things that you produce, almost like you're a tree and you produce certain things. So to be fruitful, right? To be fruitful, and in certain contexts, like in the New Testament, you'll have bearing fruit, like joy, peace, long suffering, faithfulness, things like that. That's in a different context. Here it's just referring to offspring, but then fruitfulness, bearing fruit, that is something that is more in the more spiritual context, in like Galatians. And it's important as Christians that we bear fruits of the Spirit and not fruits of, I forget the exact terminology it uses. Let's actually open up Galatians 5 really quick. Just look at that very briefly. We're not gonna be so deep into this. We're not gonna exegete Galatians 5. Oh, hold on a second. All right, so you have your work, or fruits of the flesh, you can say, because it says here works of the flesh. You can also say fruits of the flesh, and these are all the fruits of the flesh here. It's just a ton there, right? So that's something important. It's not necessarily within the context of Genesis 1 here, but that is something to remember, right? Bear good fruits as Christians, and all this stuff disappeared. All my highlights, all my notes just disappeared. So that's just great. Fantastic. Anyway, let's go here to verse 23. So the evening and the morning were the fifth day. I think I want to review that just a little bit. Let's just review the day just very briefly. I mentioned it back in part 1. There's multiple views. I'm not going to go into all of them deeply, but there's different views on the evening and morning, right? So some might say that it's literal, which would be my perspective. I think it's referring to a 24-hour period. Some might say it's just a metaphor, right? Not literally a 24-hour period. I'm trying to open up what the positions are so I can kind of remember exactly. So some might say that it's literal, but then they're also separated by intervals of time, which would be like an intermittent day view. Some might just say it's metaphorical of the work week, not necessarily literal. Some see it as just a literary framework that, for example, so it's Genesis 1 has some literary features, like almost like it's literature, poetry almost. So they might say, well, it's not literally days, it's just to present this almost like poem. So that, different days on that, different views on that. I hold to the literal view that it's a 6 consecutive 24-hour days. But hey, different views on that. I'm not going to be dogmatic and say mine is absolutely right. There's different interpretations, and it's important to understand that the Bible does not exactly tell us what the days are to be interpreted as, or the evening and morning, but you can, be open to it and try to make sure you have a consistent view, right? Be consistent. Make sure you have a consistent view of Genesis, at least. I think my view of Genesis, even though I could be wrong, I think mine is consistent enough to like, hey, I can interpret it like this. But make sure you're being faithful to the text, interpreting it in light of the text, trying to let the text speak, not imposing things on it, and just be careful of that. So I think we're gonna stop here because I don't have much else to say. I guess I felt a little sloppy at times on my part, so I'm sorry about that. But I think we had a good session here, exploring coming forth from their kind, things like that. I do think, and let me actually pull up here the goodbye banner. Oh my goodness! So I do think we're gonna end it here. I believe that next part is really gonna pick up because so far we've been looking at the days individually and individually. We've been looking at, something that's felt a little repetitive, maybe. Not that the Bible is boring or repetitive. It's just, the way I'm formatting this, we're sort of saying the same thing almost. But I think next part is really going to pick up because we're going to be exploring the sixth day. I think the entirety of it, I think. I don't know yet. And we'll be looking at, for example, uh, being made in the image of God, the usage of us in verse 26. So we'll be looking at that. So that'll be a little interesting. So stay tuned for that. But with that being said, I think we are done here. And yeah, as it says there, goodbye. Actually, I can change it to something. We'll do it another time. But God bless you all and good.